Questions. Why do the Gospels make reference to Christ's brothers and sisters when we as Catholics believe that Mary was ever a virgin? So we have to look at a few things here. The first thing is, how were the Gospels written? And most of the Gospels were written as a result of the resurrection of Christ. So you have this wonderful event that is going to give birth to the church, and somebody has to start writing this down. Now, most of these were written down in the middle of that first century because apostles were beginning to die. And so they said somebody has to write this stuff down. The stories were being passed on and on. So as the apostles began to write these stories, they wrote the resurrection stories. And then the question came up, what about the Passion? So then they wrote about the Passion. And then people were wondering, well, what about his ministry before the Passion? And so they wrote about his ministry before the Passion. And then finally, what about his baptism? And this is actually where Mark kind of stops his gospel. He begins his gospel with the baptism of Christ and then moves forward to everything up until the resurrection. Matthew and Luke, who wrote a little later than Mark, are now dealing with this question. Well, let's learn a little bit about his childhood. How was he brought up? And then let's learn about how his birth occurred, which is why Luke and Matthew have this story about the nativity of Jesus. And finally, what about before the birth? How did this all come about? And so that's again where Matthew and Luke both dealt with this question of how it actually happened. Now, keep in mind, these things were long in tradition already. People were talking about the story that had happened. And so the question about Mary's other children, perhaps, comes in, and you'll see this in Mark's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel, where they will say, Lord, your mother and your brothers and sisters are asking about you. And everyone goes, oh, he has brothers and sisters. Well, how did this happen? How did this come about? And so with deeper research, they go to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 25. And in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 25, it reads, "And Mary did not have relations with Joseph until the day that she gave birth to the child Jesus." Aha. So we say, she didn't have relations with Joseph until that day, and after that day she had relations. Well, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. We have to be very careful that we don't continue on the sentence in our own mind's eye. So the fact that it says she did not have relations with him until the day that she bore a son, that until is meaning just up until the time. It's showing that something essentially is fulfilled. In other words, she was a virgin before she had this child. And that's how she, had the child and everything to it. So when theologians go a step further, people reading the scripture, and they say, well, what about Jesus' mother, or his mother and his brothers and sisters? When we look at that until, we can find it other places in scripture. That Jesus will reign until all men are under his feet. What does that mean? After all men are under his feet, he will not reign anymore? No. So that until is very tricky, and they played on that. So what about the brothers and sisters? Well, even now in some parts of the world, whether you're a cousin or what have you, you are referred to as a brother or a sister. And so in fact, in another place in Scripture, it says, Mary, the mother of James, the wife of Clopas, or the father, and they specifically name him, and it's not Joseph. And so it's obvious here that Mary didn't have any other children at this point, but she had these other relatives. Some think maybe it was her sister's children. They never specifically named that, and it's hard to translate that directly. So as far as virgin birth, both Matthew and Luke refer to her as Parthenos. And actually, in the biological world, there's something called parthenogenesis, which means when mating cannot occur for whatever reason, that in lower animals, say amphibians or what have you, they can actually give rise to young anyway. So Parthenos means virgin, maiden. And that is how she's talked about in the scriptures. So to answer that question, what about her other children? The fact is that there is nothing in Scripture to support the fact that she had other children, cousins, nieces, nephews, whatever that might have been. Okay?